Well, we're in the book of Numbers, I'm sure you know, a book of obedient hope and great failure. And sadly, great failure now rears its ugly head in this story as the Israelites are making their way to the promised land. Last week, we saw how the covenant people of God, having made their preparation to enter the promised land in the first 10 chapters of the book, have now begun their journey. They're moving from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab, which they will reach eventually after many years in chapter 22. So this now is the second distinct section of the book of Numbers. We've covered 50 days in chapters 1 to 10. We're now about to cover 38 years in the chapters that follow to 22. And in beginning our first travelogue from Mount Sinai to a place called Kadesh, which we'll reach in chapter 12, we'll witness how the triumphant opening acts of moving forward at the command of God according to his word now come to a stumbling halt. Malcontented, grumbling breaks out. It's brazen complaint against the Lord. The Israelites have been given, seeing it last week, great pilgrimage principles which they should follow, setting them up for a faithful walk of warfare and worship. That was the plan. But they're now about to descend into a rabble of complaining rebellion. And so the book of Numbers, once again, is for us a revealing picture and a clear warning sign for the people of God today in the New Testament church. We're moving then into chapter 11. Let's see these disastrous things. Leaving the relative fertility of the area around Mount Sinai, the Israelites soon find themselves in a bleak, inhospitable place, in a desert. And there they begin to complain. Now this is a serious thing, a serious episode. It begins, in fact, a series of serious episodes where, interestingly, every group, if you like, every part of this Israel community begins in some form to complain to the Lord. From the bottom to the top, everyone is found in complaint. What happens in this series of complaining acts is that there's a sin described and then there's a divine judgment given. Now, here's a spoiler alert for the book of Numbers. Here's a spoiler alert for you. It's appropriate to say at this point that as a result of repeated unbelief and disobedience, which starts at this place called Taberah, every single adult male then alive, apart from Joshua and Caleb, would die in this wilderness and would not enter the promised land. Every single adult male. It should have taken about a month to get there. It takes 38 years, and most are dead. Here is a serious thing, and it is the complete reversal of the triumphal attitude that we emphasized last week. You might remember that optimism of Moses when he urged Hobab to accompany the people to Canaan, where the Lord had promised good things for his people. But now it's been replaced by grumbling about the hardships that they are actually experiencing. And instead of looking forward to Canaan, the people are found looking back to Egypt and their days of slavery. Nostalgia takes over, and their former slave days are preferred. This is a complaining attitude that even affects Moses, we find. Look at verse 11. Moses asks God, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? I want to die," he says. Friends, this is serious stuff. This is serious stuff. We're going to look at chapter 11 today, and we're going to consider then this rebellion in the camp. It continues into chapter 12, and over this week and next week, we'll consider these various incidents of grumbling. There are 5 incidents or things I want to mention this week and next. They all begin with the letter B. It would be good if they began with C, wouldn't it? For complaint. But they don't. That's just my slight complaint this morning. Chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. They begin with a general, an unspecified complaint about pilgrimage difficulties. Verse 1 says, "Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused." Now, of course, as modern day travellers today, as Lisa and Raoul may soon find out, long journeys can be hard and you can have many difficulties and you can find yourself unhappy and complaining, and we might have sympathy with those kind of problems that are met on a hard journey. But in truth, this complaint of Israel was to be the beginning proof of national rebelliousness and unbelief. It's the seed, if you like, of greater things. And Numbers makes this point by describing how God was angry with this complaining, and that his fire consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. Now the picture is perhaps that things are happening on the fringe, that there's a warning going on here. Taberah, the place that is named after this incident, means burning. That's the meaning of the name, or the word Taberah. Burning. There's our first B, if you like. Fire comes. Now, fire in the Bible is a sign of divine activity. Fire can be used for blessing, but fire can also be used for judgment, as it is in this particular case. Now, it doesn't make clear, the text doesn't make clear exactly what was burned on this occasion. Was it some of the land, the shrubbery around the camp? Was it some of the tents on the edges of the camp itself? We're not told what it was. To my mind, it's a warning shot across the bows of the people of God. Well, whatever it was, it initially seemed to work. The people realized the danger they're in, and they appealed to Moses to pray for them in their trouble. And when Moses prayed, that intercession worked. God mercifully stopped there. The people were warned by this burning. But sadly, things didn't stop there. Things began on the fringe of the camp, but now things are going to break out in the center of the camp and throughout the camp. Isn't that interesting how things on the edge that may not seem so important can soon infect the whole? Take note. Take note. So now we come to our second B this morning. The people specifically now complain about bread. Bread. What a complaint. Now you might think, well, why is this so serious? What's wrong with this? Everyone complains about food from time to time. Some more than others, perhaps. There we are. We all have moans and groans about food. You may have even had some sympathy. You may have sympathy with the Israelites. They've got this miraculous manna, this bread-like substance. They've had it since they left Egypt. But they're hankering for something else. You may have sympathy with that. A change of diet. What they actually are after is the things of their previous life in Egypt. It's quite an eye-opener, isn't it, to find this list of things they wanted. Cost of living crisis. They had fresh fish at no cost. And that's wonderful, isn't it? Fish is expensive. I was amazed to find the national dish of Wales in here. Did you know that the Israelites ate leeks in Egypt? Wow, that's amazing. Melons, yummy. Garlic, wonderful. Cucumbers, not so good. But they want what they used to have, not what God's giving them now. Well, what's wrong with that, you may say? They've lost their appetite for the things that God is giving them. Is that so serious? Do you know, in this travel section of the book of Numbers, the supply of food and water is a very dominant theme. Discontent about these seemingly simple things dominates the book and the people's thinking. That's interesting, isn't it? Food and drink are central thoughts in the people's minds. Nothing much has changed, has it, over the centuries today? But here, this particular complaint now shows how discontented the people are with this, yes, monotonous year-long supply of manna, which God has given them to sustain them. But really, this complaint is real trouble, because the heart of the people is being truly revealed. This life doesn't measure up to my former life. Things went well in Egypt. You may be tempted to sympathize, as I say. But what we see here is that in being discontent with their bread, the Israelites are really saying they are discontented with their God. They're not happy with the Lord any longer. And they want a change. Now, I want you to note that the instigation of this complaint, which is described in verse 4, comes from a rabble. The rabble are described. It appears that some other people, non-Israelites, may well have come out of Egypt with the Lord's people. And they're in the camp, discontented rabble amongst the people of God, who start whispering about why should we put up with this manna. And they've stirred up a craving in the Lord's people for former things. That's interesting, isn't it? There are unbelieving hearts, uncommitted hearts, even within the camp of God. And they are infecting the whole. This is serious stuff. They're provoking within God's people opposition to God's goodness. Now that's a sobering thought for us to dwell on this morning. That in reality, the Israelites have been unduly influenced and have been led down a path of open opposition to God's purposes, even in rescuing them from Egypt in the first place is being questioned. Promising a wonderful land of plenty is wrong, somehow. That's amazing, isn't it? You couldn't make it up. Friends, this moaning about manna is really a serious statement of rebellion against the Lord. I was reminded of the many Psalms in which the writers, men like David, for example, express discontent with their lot in life now. And they express a hankering for what others have around them. Unbelievers, and how well they're doing. For example, David says in Psalm 73, I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're free from common human burdens. They're not plagued by human ills. He can't see straight, of course. David has a skewed view of the life of the unbeliever. Now, this skewed thinking and vision is corrected later. He understands the wicked better. He understands that the life of unbelievers, yes, they may seem to prosper for a time, but he comes on to understand their final destiny. David goes on to say, surely you place them on slippery ground. You cast them down to ruin. How suddenly are they destroyed, completely swept away by terrors. And he adds later, those who are far from you will perish. You destroy all who are unfaithful to you. But as for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my refuge. I will tell of all your deeds. Now, those should have been the words of the people there in the camp, but they weren't. David remembers how good God is, how good he's been in time past. And there's the crucial difference. He'll be good now. He uses similar language in Psalm 37. David begins, do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong, for like grass they will soon wither. Like green plants they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. There's the faith that should have ventured on God at that time. What's all this got to do with bread? Well, in essence, this complaint about food, as I've said, is really symptomatic of a greater distrust of the goodness of God. Do you distrust today the goodness of God in your life? You say, what a question. It's possible. Do you? Note this cry. Verse 4. If only we had meat to eat. Now, maybe you have asked something like that. Oh yeah, the life of the Christian. I'm all for it. But if only there was this. If only I didn't have to that. Here's an allegation that God is holding back on you. He's holding back things that you'd be better off with, but he won't give you them. Is that the God you know? You might have that feeling in your life. Maybe you've expressed it. Well, here's a great lesson we need to listen to this morning in this complaint. God was leading his people. He was. Therefore, they had all they needed for the time. Yeah, there was plenty coming, but they had what they needed for now. Trust it. But they complained. How sad. And this complaining was really evidence of greater unbelief. Unbelief, as I've said, which would keep many from even entering the promised land. You see this bawling about bread? It would actually banish people from the land. That's how serious this bread complaint was. Had they been grateful for God's goodness, obedient to his guidance, they'd have saved themselves a great deal of misery and trouble. So we need to remember this, don't we? The next time you're tempted to complain about the providence of God in your life, or to be envious of what the wicked have got, how things may have been for us when we were ourselves unbelievers. Looking back on that, yeah, you may have new difficulties to face. In the life of faithful pilgrimage, you'll have trouble. You will. But you're promised a heavenly rest in time and the provision of God's goodness whilst you travel. That needs to be enough. It is enough. So, let's not forget that the pleasures of the past were only ever to be fleeting. Ultimately, they will not satisfy eternally. George MacDonald once wrote, "The slaves of sin rarely complain at that slavery. It's their slavery to God they grumble about." There's truth in that we need to heed. Let's not be like them today. What's our attitude to be? It's to be of Paul, who declared to the church at Philippi in Philippians chapter 2 that believers are to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. He says, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life." I came across a hymn this week. It's not in our hymn book. We're going to sing it at the end. It teaches us some truths as believers today about the saving grace that God has demonstrated towards his people. Let me just show you 2 verses of it now. It's a hymn by William Bathurst. It goes like this: "How strange that souls whom Jesus feeds with manna from above should grieve him by their evil deeds and sin against his love. But 'tis a greater wonder still that he from whom they stray should bear with their rebellious will and wash their sins away." Now there's the grace and the goodness of God demonstrated, is it not? That's the gospel of grace that we know today. But what of the rebellious people back in the camp? Well, God's response to this complaint is graphically described in the chapter, isn't it? In verses 18 to 20, God tells the people that if you want meat, you'll get meat. Boy, will you get meat, not for 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, you'll get it for a whole month. And then you'll be sick of your meat. That's what you get for rejecting me. You get what you ask for. God provides, doesn't he? These small birds. He's done it before. They've forgotten about these quail. God has done it before. He does it again. He does it in such great numbers that it seems that if you walked a day's walk from the camp, you'd be walking through quail 3 feet deep. That's how many were swept in by this miraculous wind of God that brought meat to the people. What a meat feast the people had. Verses 33 to 34 reveal this quail bonanza comes, but with it comes this severe plague. The Lord's anger is described. They complained about wanting more of what they didn't need, and they died there. Because of this complaint, they were buried at a place called Kibroth Hattaavah. Places have meanings. Kibroth Hattaavah, not a nice place to look upon your map. Graves of craving. It's lovely, isn't it? Do you know that the journey of the Israelite pilgrimage has many tragic place name lessons for us to take note of today? Here are graves of craving. Our third for today and final B is found then in the narrative of this grumbling about bread. It's the dialogue that follows between Moses and God following the people's complaint. It's a complaint about burdens that Moses brings to God. It occupies the most part of verses 10 to 25. Very briefly, let me say this. Moses cries, doesn't he, to the Lord about his inability to take care of these people alone. And then he describes the utter impossibility of providing meat for such a multitude. And finally, he says, I'd rather die to escape my trouble. He's in a bit of a state, isn't he, Moses? What's the Lord's reply? Well, the Lord replies by providing 70 elders to share the burden of the people with Moses. Now, we thought last week about Exodus 18. Do you remember there, with the help of Jethro, his father-in-law, Moses had appointed other men to act as civil authorities, to share the burden of leadership. Well, now there are 70 elders given to Moses to help bear this further burden, spiritual burden, rather than the practical work that Moses was struggling with. And when these 70 elders are officially installed, if you like, the Spirit of the Lord comes in power on them and they speak revelations from God before the people. Now it's important for us to see here how the burden of leading and caring for the people was shared out amongst others. This is another New Testament church principle that we must not miss. These people are led by God, practically and spiritually, but they're not on earth led by one, but by many. They are helped in their work by elders and deacons and others too, putting their shoulder to the work that needs to be done. We've seen in the earlier chapters of Numbers how many people had their part to play. And it's a reminder again to us here that these burdens should not be complained about, for the Lord has given those to the church that he wants to do his work. But note in this complaining about burdens how Moses is grieved. He's grieved because the people have criticized both him and God. And he's rightly frustrated that the Lord's people have forgotten their slavery in Egypt. They've rejected his sufficiency for them in providing. He's despairing. He feels he can't go on. But what do we see? In quite a bleak chapter, it has to be said, we see this. We're encouraged to see how Moses must not be in despair. Even when his own people disappoint him, he comes to God, his God. He comes, as we said to the children, in prayer. Moses does what all of us must do when we are disappointed and when we are in despair. What does the hymn that we often sing say? We take it to the Lord in prayer. We must bring things like this to him and tell God just how we feel. What happened when he did that? God met his need, God encouraged his servant, and God set things right. Try him yourself. Now, Moses did appear skeptical, didn't he, about how the Lord could solve his problem. He questions God. Whoa, this is Moses, remember. God is gracious towards his servant. He gives a divine wait and see answer. Verse 23 is really wait and see. What does he say? Is the Lord's arm too short, Moses? Do you think I can't do this? Yes. There's his answer. He can. God would prove once more the faithfulness and the power he has. Well, there we are, our third B of burdens. Next week, we'll continue to consider two more complaints, beginning with B. There's one more in Numbers 11. There's a big one in Numbers 12. But for now, I want to summarize with these thoughts. We've seen how the Israelites cried out that they couldn't live on bread alone. You can't really live on bread alone. That cry has an echo in the New Testament, doesn't it? Remember in the Gospels how Jesus undoubtedly saw himself as being the one who in many ways relived the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness. That's what Jesus did on earth. When invited to turn stones into bread, Jesus quoted Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, saying, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Remember the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. That's a recalling, really, of God's provision given to the Israelites, miraculously feeding them when there was no food. In fact, that parallel is explicitly given in John 6, verse 33, where Jesus identified himself with the true bread from heaven. And he told his disciples that they must eat of him if they want to live eternally. Tonight at communion, we'll be thinking of that very thing, will we not, as we break bread together. And finally, the Apostle Paul, he warns the Spirit-filled church of Corinth to remember the judgments, even the ones we've considered this morning from the Old Testament. There, Paul says, remember these tragedies which befell the Israelites in the wilderness. Don't follow their same fate. That's why they're written for us. That's why I'm speaking about them to you now. Don't do likewise. That's the necessary sobering thought that we would do well to ponder as we close our service this morning. Amen.